This episode of AHLA's Speaking of Health Law is brought to you by AHLA members and donors like you. For more information, visit AmericanHealthLaw.org.
Well, hello and welcome to our podcast. We're here today to discuss legal and compliance issues in cosmetic medicine. I'm Erin Aebel. I'm a board-certified health lawyer out of Tampa, Florida. I've been practicing law for 29 years, and I have a wide range of clients, some physicians, hospitals, dentists, chiropractors. But a good portion of my practice is representing people who do cosmetic medicine, such as med-spas. And so that's why I was interested in this topic. And then I've got my good friend, Chase Howard, who is another attorney who practices in this area. And I'll let him introduce his practice before we get started.
Thanks, Erin. Yes, so I've been practicing a little bit less than 29 years. However, all of my practice experience has really been in the cosmetic alternative medicine space. In fact, my first client ever was a med spa. And so I've just kind of been in that space ever since. But I call myself a healthcare lawyer. I focus my practice on healthcare regulatory and corporate guidance to clients, in the state of Florida and nationwide, depending upon the matter. I am also based out of Tampa, Florida, although we're part of separate firms, but we end up doing quite a bit of work together or opposite of each other, both moving clients forward and helping them split apart in some cases. So it's good to be here, and I'm very excited to talk about this topic with you.
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this topic, Chase was the first person I thought about because we approach it from different angles. I am more of the compliance and regulatory lawyer, while he is very well aware of those issues. He is a mergers and acquisitions attorney and does a lot of deal documents. But what's funny is how we met as opposing counsel. We were on a very difficult deal where our clients couldn't stand each other, and we were having to navigate healthcare and business law issues. And I just have a lot of respect for Chase and how he handled it. And then we became friends after that. And sometimes we meet for coffee and talk about business. And so, it just goes to show you, you never know what kinds of ways you're going to build relationships, even in a very adversarial situation.
Yeah, and it's so funny. I think that's what the beauty of being in the healthcare space is. A lot of the times you can be working, with clients to move something forward, to work together. And it's not really contentious, although the way that we met obviously was, I think it really, allowed us to, be professionals and colleagues and build a relationship past that and outside of that. That's actually been beneficial to both us and our clients going forward, because we do a lot of different things, even though we're both, healthcare lawyers.
Right. That's one of my favorite things. Well, the couple of my favorite things about being a health lawyer is the industry and how it's constantly evolving. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And also really how collegiate the legal practice is and how we all kind of try to help each other out a lot of times, because it is a very difficult and evolving area.
It is, absolutely. Yeah. And it's such, it changes every single day. So
yeah,
I'm
never
constantly learning from, competitors essentially, but I don't look at them that way. Everyone teaches you something. You've taught me a lot over the years. And, I hope that today we're able to kind of share some of our experience that'll, I think just open eyes, or, have other healthcare lawyers look in different ways of how to approach these changing and evolving healthcare practices and clinics that we have in our country. It's not, hospitals anymore only. It's not physician practices. It's a lot of, concierge medicine, precision medicine, elective cosmetic medicine. And with that comes a lot of changes in how you approach the client as well.
Exactly. So I was just talking to my colleagues in my law firm and saying, I'm talking about cosmetic, but they're like, oh, yeah, that a field? Like, is that a business? I said, that is very, very big business. I pulled the data point that I wanted to share. And then if you have anything, the U.S. cosmetic medical market is expected to grow from $22.64 billion in 2025 to $36.35 billion in 2034, according to a report by Custom Market Insights. So it is a huge part of our American business structure.
Yeah, when I had my first client, and this will tell you how long I've been practicing now, which again is not as long as Erin, but in 2017, this data read something like 2.2 billion, and it was expected to grow to about 12 billion 3 or 4 years later. So you can see the astronomical growth in such a short amount of time. And really, I think this data is probably focused largely on like, the beauty cosmetics, right? The fillers, injectables, lasers, things like that. And it might not even take into account all of the wellness and integrative medicine modalities that come with it, which are related, I think, to the med spa world, the feeling good world, and things like that. So this market is probably even larger than that, and certainly going to grow a bit more.
Yeah, so a lot of people who are health lawyers think, oh, I'm advising on Medicare and Medicaid, and I do advise, and so do you, but
Right.
that is just a fraction of the field that is regulated by all the different laws. So with that said, let's delve right into the law, because I want to make sure that we talk about some really important issues that we deal with on a regular basis in cosmetic medicine. First and foremost is the corporate practice of medicine. And a lot of people will throw that out and not really explain what that means. It's interesting in the state of Florida because we are not a corporate practice of medicine state clearly at all, but in other states they are. And what that means is there are state laws that say that only a medical doctor can own a legal entity that bills and collects for medical services.
Right.
And it can even be criminal. Like I know California and New York and Texas have some very strict laws. And what have I explained that well enough, Chase, or do you have anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, some people might just hear California, Texas, right, New York, but really it's roughly 34 states have an explicit prohibition on it. A few others have some kind of wishy-washy statements on it, or their statute might simply say you can't open a professional corporation unless you have a professional license. So you've got to be really, really careful. And in the world we're talking about, and it's kind of going to help us flow in our conversation here, it's very easy to go across state lines in treatment of patients, which means you're very quickly going to potentially violate corporate practice of medicine in one of these 34 plus states, right? So it's overlooked, I think, largely because it's not the hot topic like anti-kickback or Stark, right? And a lot of the owners of these clinics happen to be non-licensed professionals, right? So it's not something a traditional, I think, medical practice or even healthcare lawyer might look at all the time. But in my world, I mean, it's the number one question I ask is, do you have a license, right? Because if you're practicing or employing healthcare professionals, this is the biggest hurdle you have to get over.
Right. So entrepreneurs are the kind of people that come to us, whether they have a license or not, and want to get into business because they see the profit margins. And then, I always want to encourage people to start new businesses and do things as they can, but also mitigate risk. And so the first thing I ask is, what's your license?
Right.
Oh, you don't have a license. Okay, well, you need to know about this because you're going in. There might be high profit margins, but you're going into a highly regulated industry.
Yes.
And so how do you normally? Yeah, go ahead.
One more big thing on that is there's 50 states, which means there's 50 laws. So if you get it right at one state, you might get it right in a couple others, but likely you have to adjust and make sure you tweak, whatever arrangement or structure you have for those other states, because again, they all have their own laws that say what you can and can't do when you're interacting with, medical care or services.
And so for people who this is a new concept, you're like, well, how do you deal with this? If it's criminal, can you not go into business? There are business structures that are put into place in various states. A common one is a management company arrangement where a licensee, which is the doctor, is the entity that bills and collects for the healthcare services, be it a med spa or some other cosmetic business, owns, it's owned by a doctor. Then the doctor has a management arrangement with a management company that could be owned by investors because it's not regulated as much who can own a management company. Now, there are regulations in all the states. You have to look at is how can you charge the management fees? Can you do percentage fees? In Florida, that might be problematic if it's for marketing services. So even though there's no Medicare and Medicaid, you still have to look at all of those issues when you're putting together these management company arrangements, which is really what you see when you have an unlicensed person getting into a medical business.
Yeah. I mean, it's great. It's great for us when this happens because it's, a lot of time spent going through the analysis and educating. But I think for a lot of business owners, it's meaning non-licensed persons, entrepreneurs that want to get into the space. The worlds that they are used to typically don't have this type of regulation and oversight, and so they tend to overlook how complex it could be, and frankly, what risk comes with it. So, yeah, it's the number one question I think you have to get by first. And if you can get by it and live with the structures that you have to live with to do it legally and compliantly, then you kind of get into the rest of it, which isn't as, isn't any easier. It's, just as complex, but ownership is really, the first number one issue.
Yeah, that is. And then the other question I usually look at, and this is a nationwide presentation, so you really have to look at like what licenses do I need to operate.
Right.
Interestingly, and this is something not a lot of people know about, while anyone can maybe own a medical business in the state of Florida, you may need to have a special license called a healthcare clinic license if you're billing insurers.
Right.
A cash-only business may be exempt from healthcare clinic licensure. So those are the types of questions. The second question is, what is my barrier to entry? Can I own a business that does this legally?
Right.
And if not, how do I structure my investment, or can I structure an investment to own this in a way that works out? And then secondly is, what kind of licenses do I need? It's not just, sometimes it's just the providers who need to have the license, but in certain states there could be facility or other types of licenses, like massage establishment license, it's different things.
Right. Cosmetology permits, right? Yeah, we have in this space, we have this overlay of so many different types of licensees, services, which means there's different boards and different potential permits, whether it's Department of Health, Board of Cosmetology, that all come into play here.
Exactly. And then the other issue, so let's say we get through the basic barriers to entry into the cosmetic medical business. Another area that you and I when we were preparing for this, we were discussing that we see a lot of is telehealth. And it's a separate topic in and of itself. Like, we could do a whole podcast on telehealth, but basically that is providing healthcare via video or phone or something other than in person, seeing someone personally in the office. And that is I think patients like that a lot because they like the convenience and not having to get out of their home. Often entrepreneurs like it because maybe it's less expensive and they can, get a lot more, whatever the cosmetic service are. So some things, obviously, like Botox and fillers, you're going to have to be in person for that.
Right. Yeah, there could be more wellness focused services, vitamin,
weight loss,
hormones,
things like that. But the other thing, the big picture thing to keep in mind is this is just a regulated industry. Like every state. I know Florida has its own telehealth guidelines, and telemedicine guidelines are in the Medical Practice Act regulations, and certain things you can and cannot do. So, and in fact, there's 50 state surveys on the corporate practice of medicine, but there's also on telehealth laws because every state's a little different, right? Yeah,
COVID changed everything. Simply because people weren't allowed to leave their homes. In a sense, right? If you wanted care, unless it was super emergency, you had to do it remotely. And so, that was bad, obviously, because it was a, pretty bad time of life for everybody. But at the same time, it was really good for healthcare because it allowed providers, it actually forced providers, I think, to evolve in how they can provide treatments in a more efficient manner. And I think what patients learned is they really like it, they want it, and they probably want it sometimes more than they do to, whether they live in a rural area and have to drive far, or, I live down the street from my doctor. I'd rather just get on a video and say, hey, I've got a little sinus infection, what can we do? Instead of going to a waiting room and waiting and driving and parking, right? So it most of the time created more efficient practices. It gave greater access to people. But what it did in the cosmetic and wellness world is it just exploded the amount of providers that could be in that space and the reach that they had on patients. That's good and bad because we saw a drop off in standard of care because a lot of providers just thought, well, sometimes I don't even need a video, or they're not thinking about what state the patient is in. They're not doing a full physical or good faith exam on the patient. They're not getting blood work, right? So standard of care dropped off, which is important because standard of care has to remain the same as in person. But access really shot up and convenience shot up. And so, I think from a regulators' perspective, it's hard for them to balance, right? They want to protect the patient, but the patient really wants this. So as a provider, and as a, lawyer advising a provider, I think you have to really hone in on understanding your laws for how you establish, patient relationships, prescribing, regulations, maintaining a high level or the appropriate standard of care. But also from a business perspective, how can you do this in a way that allows you to reach more people, and expand your, elective cosmetic wellness business?
Yeah, exactly. So I think like the first question when I deal with clients on this is, can you use the telehealth platform for what you want to do? Like there may be restrictions with certain type of controlled substances. You
Right.
may not be able to use it. And then the other thing that you point out that I just want to reiterate because I think it's so important is that you have to be able to provide the same standard of care as if the person were in the office. You have to be as good as that.
Right.
And I still do. So I have patient consents for telehealth to make it like extra protective of my client that they consented to it. But really, it has to be something you can do as well. And I have a lot of physician friends and clients, and some will tell me, yes, I can do a great job via telehealth. It's very, and then other times they'll say, in certain instances, I really just have to see the patient. This is
Right.
not enough. So,
Right.
you know,
And I think too, it's important that the patient understands the limitations of telehealth, right? And
right.
that's the legal liability side, right? How do you disclose to the patient that telehealth is probably not as good as in person, right? If I can't physically touch you or examine you, I might miss things, or I'm probably going to miss things versus on a video. One, two, there could be issues with connectivity with the platform you're using. There could be security breaches, right? So there's more risk with it, obviously. Ultimately, if the patient consents to it, I think that's important. And to your point, having some sort of consent form or disclosure that kind of lays out some of the pros and cons of it, almost like a treatment, in itself, I think is a good practice, to push onto your clients to say, here's how to protect yourself if you're starting to expand your telehealth business.
That's a great point. And you know what I've noticed, and I'm sure you've seen too, because I have clients in this area of business or doctors who want to work for a telehealth company. I just reviewed a teleradiology contract last week. Some of them, there's these big physician practices that have cropped up where they represent that they have physicians licensed in all 50 states.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the big issues too. Is like you can't do telehealth on a patient in a state where you're not licensed.
Right.
So I have seen them crop up. I don't know. I can't say whether one's better than the other or whether it's a good practice model, but I have seen that practice model so that people are like, I want to have a national telehealth practice. They contract with a provider that can say, I've got all the 50 states covered.
Right.
So I have seen
Right.
that.
Yeah. And so here's the stack you've got to be careful of, right? You live in, Florida, right? You comply with corporate practice and medicine laws, but now you've got a patient in Georgia and Tennessee and Texas, and you don't have a license there. Well, let me contract with somebody that does have a license there, right? Well, now we've got to look at you're practicing medicine in those states, right? Or you own a company that's practicing medicine in those states. So are you compliant with corporate practice laws in those states? And then on top of that, are you compliant with, payment arrangements, right? Are you paying that doctor or that group that provides the doctor, in a way that's compliant with federal or state anti-kickback or fee splitting laws, right? So, now you're tracking, right? We're all of these are stacking on top of each other just to say, I want to open up a clinic that can treat patients in a couple states on aesthetics, right? And we haven't even gotten into insurance really, right? And how that comes in. I'm not going to because I stay away from that world, as much as I can. But it's just these little regulations that are state laws and scope of practice, supervision, ownership that just compound on each other. And getting one wrong could obviously be, detrimental to a client's, business, practice, license, whatever.
I want to build on that because I think it's an important nuance. It could be in cosmetic medicine and it could be in other areas, but definitely in the cash-based medical business space is oftentimes you are dealing with a client who is not licensed and who is being somewhat of a middleman in between the patient and the provider.
Mm-hmm.
And the question, which is not easy to answer, especially if you have multiple states, is what am I doing? And can I be legally paid for it?
Right.
Because it's am I practicing medicine without a license? Am I getting fee splitting illegally for referring patients? You
Right.
know, or am I doing legitimate management service and get paid a fair market value management fee? I
Right.
mean, and they just, entrepreneurs are smart people out there they're like, they see a need, they see a customer base, customers want it or patients want it,
Right.
and they're trying to put something together. And so it is challenging because a lot of the laws that we deal with as healthcare lawyers have not evolved to deal with what's going on in the healthcare industry. That's a theme
Right.
that I've seen throughout my decades of practice is, we're doing all this stuff with cosmetic medicine, there's developments in telehealth. Have the laws really caught up?
Yeah, there's a lot of
What's going on?
band-aids that are placed along the way, but they don't actually, encompass what's happening on the ground in clinics and how people are practicing.
Yes, that's why I feel like we're in the grassroots of healthcare because we get our work a lot of times by what people are doing and
Right.
what's going on, and then we have to react to it with the laws that we have to date.
Right. Right.
So,
I always start off with clients that want a regulatory, drop on what can or can't I do with, I have to tell them, disclose, there's not a lot of laws or there's not one set of laws that says, here's what you can do, right? There's a number of sources that might apply. And that's oftentimes just the guidance that we can give is this may apply. And this is our best guess of, here's what the laws might say, right? That apply. Here are your options. Here are some risks that go with it. And, do with that what you want, right? If you have a high risk tolerance, you can push it a little bit. If you don't, then I would maybe stay away from this because there's nothing to support you one way or another.
yeah, exactly. You don't want your client to be making the law in the area.
That's it. And I always say you don't want to
Yeah,
be the example. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's a difficult place to be. So
Right.
the other issue that I think we see a lot. Oh my God, I see probably. I could have made this the number one issue, but I did it because I wanted to talk about these other big picture things first. Is scope of practice.
Yeah.
And let's look at it from the patient and the business person or provider's perspective. There's so much going on there. And scope of practice is really, what does that mean? That means, what can I do with my license?
Right.
And does it overlap with what someone else can do with their license? And what I have seen is that sometimes business owners, they want to have profits. And so they want to use the least expensive, lowest level of licensure to do something, but that might not be the right person to do the work. Or maybe like one of those gray areas you're talking about, maybe
Right.
you'd be safer with a nurse practitioner and not an LPN,
Right.
and nothing wrong with LPNs, but, and then in the other area of scope of practice is there's some turf wars going on in every state there are. So
Yeah.
whether I think a paramedic can do an IV in your home properly or not and safely, or I think a medical esthetician can probably safely do radio frequency microneedling. Is that legal? Because
Right.
some people, one thing is, can I do it safely? Some people feel that they have the training, and maybe I would argue they do, but it doesn't matter at the end of the day as a lawyer. We have to say what is within your scope of practice and what can you do. And if it's not in your scope of practice, you cannot do it unless we change the law or get a
Right.
declaratory statement, or whatever your process is in your state,
Yeah.
discussing the scope.
Yeah, I would say this to his face. My dad is a physician, and I would never trust him to start an IV on me versus paramedic, an EMT, or whatever, an RN, somebody with a quote lower level or different level of license, because those are the people that are doing it day in and day out, sometimes in the worst and craziest conditions. And frankly, my dad probably hasn't done it since medical school, right? So, when you talk about who's actually most experienced versus what their license allows them to do, very different, right? And I think patients probably want the most experience, but certainly they want to make sure that, it's being done safely as well. And as a business owner, you hit it, right? What's the least expensive way, for me to provide this service to patients, right? Because everything costs so much. I want to make sure I make some sort of profit off this. Excuse me. So
Right.
yeah, it's really, really tricky. And, you brought something up with like estheticians. A lot of the times in Florida, estheticians, well, an esthetician actually isn't even a license in the state of Florida.
Right. They're cosmetic. They're under the Board of Cosmetology. There's
Right,
no such thing as a medical esthetician. And now a medical assistant is something, and you can be
right,
a trained esthetician that operates as a medical assistant. But the
right,
doctor
right.
has to be right there, and it's very limited in what you can do.
Yeah, and then when you think about estheticians or cosmetologists, right, and they fall under that board, that's not medical. That's professional and business, completely different, governmental board in the state of Florida and many other states similar. Some states have medical estheticians, but I oftentimes get the question, well, if I have a physician that supervises me, couldn't I be a medical esthetician? Well, they're different. Having a physician doesn't change anything unless you're on site with them, and then you're a medical assistant and the doctor's in the room with you. So there's so many, I think groups and boards and blogs out there that there's a lot of information shared, and unfortunately it's not always accurate. And people
Yeah.
sort of get this idea in their head of, oh, I read this and I can do it, or everyone's doing it that way, so why can't I do it that way?
I'll just throw out a generalization that may not apply everywhere, but I will throw it out anyway because I see it all the time. Nurse practitioners are great, and really physician assistants too, and they can do a lot normally without a doctor on site. In Florida, we have there is a way for a nurse practitioner to be an independent practice, but it's only as to primary care.
Right.
So unless you're getting
And
Botox,
that definition is so poorly written that,
it's very
what does
hard.
that even mean? Right.
Yeah, if you're getting, because they'll be like, I'm an independent practice, so I need a protocol physician for my money spa. And of course you do. You're not just doing Botox for migraines.
Yeah.
So yes. So check your state. But those higher trained licensees that are under doctors are usually very helpful in this industry and can do a lot and really do have a lot of experience with Botox fillers.
Right.
Other types of services, and can really generally speaking, safely perform a lot. I I have been involved from time to time in a process to expand a scope of practice, and other people in my office have too. And it's not going to be this. I'm going to just generally describe in Florida what goes on, but check in your relevant state. We have a declaratory statement process. It's an administrative process where you can ask the board, I'm an RN and the doctor's right there and I'm trained in Botox. Can I inject patients with Botox? I think the key is the doctor has to be there in Florida. But those are the types of scope of practice questions. And normally how we do it is we'll call the board lawyer first and say, hey, take your temperature. Because we don't want to have like a negative thing sometimes. But if they're like, yeah, I think they'd be open to that, and then you do the deck action. So there are ways to ask the regulatory boards in various states about this, about expanding practice as developments occur. But just be wary of that and know that there's a process you can probably look into in your state and possibly expand, or you can work with trade organizations to, get some of these practices expanded, or you can do it by statute. If the one that I was talking about, the nurse doing Botox, it would have to arguably be under the current statutory framework. If you want to really expand practice, you would work with a lobbyist and get your state laws changed.
Yeah, I think declaratory statements are a powerful tool. And at least in Florida, there's a lot of flexibility underneath the current statutes.
Exactly. So the last area I want to talk about before we talk about kind of what we're seeing is the hot topics or the hot areas. This is an area that I see all the time, and I even have a medical advertising checklist. It's advertising and marketing. Because again, I'm looking at those entrepreneurial clients that are coming in my office wanting the high profits, the startup of the business, the low costs, and also they want to market and get in as many patients as possible. In the cosmetic medical industry, some people have the misconception that there's no Medicare or TRICARE or Medicaid, so it's not regulated. That is not true at all. There are very strong, in Florida and other states, there are very strong criminal laws or laws that can get your medical director in trouble for false or misleading advertising. In Florida and in many other states, it's a felony to pay for patient brokering, which is like kickback, you know. And so you just have to be thoughtful about how you pay marketers. You can't give someone $100 per referral.
Right,
you know,
right.
And you know who turns you in, right, Chase? It's the competitors. They're like,
Right.
well, my lawyer said I couldn't do that, but look at this letter I got from the MediSpa. I'm gonna write the Board of Medicine, and guess who gets dinged for that? Maybe the providers if they're owners, or the actual medical director who's agreed to be the protocol physician.
Who's probably not even been to the clinic in their life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, competitors, and then sometimes, upset employees, former employees, things like that, who, don't like how, their employment ended, right? So you've got to be really careful with that.
Yeah, and then the other thing that we were talking about when we were preparing for this was off-label promotion.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's another area you cannot promote off-label.
Right. Yeah. So from the standpoint of advertising services or products, especially in this space, you've got to be really, really careful with how you promote weight loss drugs or, regenerative medicine, treatments, right? The FDA has purview over, obviously food, drugs, right? Cosmetics, right? So if something either isn't FDA approved or is, explicitly prohibited by the FDA, or you're using it off-label from an FDA use, you have to be really, really careful with how you advertise that treatment or service, how you disclaim that to the patient, right? Patient education consent is obviously, first and foremost, and you don't want to be misleading about it. You don't want to, make, statements that are untrue or misrepresent, exactly what could happen. And so, you overlook it, but look at how you're marketing. Look at what your, Instagram says about this treatment or whatever it is, and find out if you have to say something specifically to, what the FDA says. You've got to be really careful with it, because not only will the board come down on you, but the FDA, could inquire or send a letter, right? Make a statement as well. And that could really crush not only your business, but your license if you have one, or your provider's licenses.
I try to be very proactive about it, because I think many business owners who are entering into a cosmetic medical business may not even be aware that their advertising is regulated. And just by way of example, in the state of Florida alone, there is a regulation under the Medical Practice Act that says that you cannot have false or misleading advertising. The medical director's name has to be in your ad for medical services.
Right.
There is like a very detailed disclaimer that you have to have in your ad if you offer free or discounted services. Like I said, kickbacks, referral fees, those are actually felonies. And that's just in this, and then the off-label promotion. That's just this, some state and federal laws that we'd be looking at for every business. So I try to be proactive, and when I know I have a new client in this area, that's why I created the medical advertising checklist. And I'm like, here, look at this, and then let's talk about your advertising. And also how you pay marketers. It is very commonplace to want to pay people based on their production in this field. And so, we have to have a conversation about the risks in that, and how you can structure pay for marketing people. It may be different if they're employees versus independent contractors in Florida. And
listen, if you don't want to get in trouble, then you're not gonna be public facing, right? You're not gonna have patients, you're not gonna market, you're not gonna advertise. But obviously, every clinic is gonna want to do that. And once you put yourself on the map, that's where you are going to start to see scrutiny from, the three-letter agencies that are out there. So have that done correctly, because that's the first thing they're going to see. And that's going to lead them, to you further. And unfortunately, a lot of these agencies and people that work there are not familiar with these types of clinics. So if they see something that they don't like, right, they're going to, kind of shoot first and ask questions later. And that's going to, now you're behind the eight ball and trying to defend yourself versus, hey, I had everything correct and they didn't even look at me, or they didn't even inquire any further. So protect yourself on the front end, build a, big shield out there with how you market by doing it compliantly. And I think you'll really avoid, a lot of unnecessary inquiries.
Exactly. The other thing I wanted to mention is medical directors, and this is really for the doctors from their perspective. Doctors are going to be, not whether you're a business owner or not, the physicians are going to play an important part in this cosmetic medical industry, whether they're the owner or the direct provider or just the supervisor. It is a good field to get into. They certainly can supervise and train people. They just need to know what they're getting into, and they can't just dial it in or phone it in. They really, because they do have legitimate liability for supervising these providers.
The biggest misconception I see when I, talk to a doctor that says, "Hey, I've got this agreement to supervise or be a medical director," is they think I've got no risk, no liability, and no responsibility, right? And couldn't be further from the truth. You are the name, you are the license, you are responsible for the people that are touching patients, right? Treating patients. And if you're out to lunch and not paying attention, if you're not experienced, if you don't know what's going on or have any involvement, whether there's, just general protocols or there's, adverse events and you're not involved, you're going to get hit pretty hard, when someone, files a lawsuit or a board or agency comes in and says, who are we going after? Because who's doing the most wrong here? So, for $1,000 a month, right? You better really make sure you know exactly what your responsibilities are, what everyone's doing, and be protected if something goes wrong. Because that amount of money is not worth it for your license or for a lawsuit. So, I see a lot of really low cost engagements, and unfortunately, with that, I think people think this means I don't have to do much or worry about anything, but really it's a lot of responsibility and liability.
Exactly. Well, I think we've covered like the main big issues that we see a lot. And before we end our podcast, I wanted to go into what some of the trends are. Like I said, we're the grassroots lawyers. We see what's going on. What are you seeing? What's out there, Chase, in the grassroots?
So if I could pick like 4 topics or 5 topics, it's the GLP-1s, compound medications, right? Weight loss drugs. IV therapy is continuing to evolve and develop. And then the biohacking and what I call the precision medicine world, right? A lot of that is focused on, wellness. There's, physical aesthetics that go into that as well. But I think those treatments and those areas are, so young in the space, and people want more and more to look young, feel young, right? Live forever, reverse their age, and know exactly what's going on with their body. That area is going to continue to expand. And right now, there's not a lot of regulation, excuse me, on those areas. So, GLP-1s, weight loss drugs, the FDA, has been very involved with those recently because a lot of those drugs were on the FDA shortage list. They recently came off the FDA shortage list, and now the drug manufacturers, the Eli Lilly's, Novo Nordisk, et cetera, they now get to, recontrol this weight loss world and journey that people are on rather than compound pharmacies. And so now you've got a lot of people who are like battling with, do I use compound drugs? Do I use the FDA approved drugs? There's marketing issues there, all of this stuff. But that space is going to continue to grow. It's so young, but it's constantly developing. And I think a lot of people really, really are interested in it.
And then the other thing that you and I were saying that I wrote an article on it because it was so popular is IV therapy. People want the convenience of, I have the flu, I have a hangover, I just want to feel better. Come into my house and give me an IV therapy. And then what's interesting in that, like we're dealing with it in Florida, but it's a nationally popular issue is who can do it, what level of licensure. And then if you go into someone's home, are you a home health agency? What are you? Do you need other licenses to go into people's homes? What if you do it in a van outside of someone's home? What if you have a brick and mortar practice? So
scope of practice, who can actually perform it, and supervision, who needs to be there, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
there's a lot that goes into IV therapy, more complex, compounded bags, right? Who's compounding it, right? What type of requirements for compounding do you need to have before you can actually create a bag and then deliver it to a patient? Yeah, that's growing. And the instant delivery of it, I think is the big aspect where you've got telehealth that's going to overlay on it. You've got licensure, like you said. It's going to be interesting to see how that continues to develop, across the country.
I feel like we could do a podcast about so many of the topics we just discussed. We could
Yeah.
go in deep in some of these.
Each of these areas, yeah. And
They
then I
really
think
are.
that the last one is that precision medicine, right? Which is really, an approach to healthcare that has, custom treatments, right? You're looking at people's genetics, their lifestyle, their environment, and it's preventative medicine, but like on steroids, for lack of a better term. It's a way in which you're like not only just looking 6 months in advance, right? But years in advance and saying, how can I prevent things from happening, diseases, et cetera, or even reverse things that are happening to me? And those clinics are, super, super, I think, elite right now. But there's a lot of, online ones that are popping up, blood tests at home that go further than what you get at, Quest and LabCorp, right? So being able to understand and advise clients on all the nuanced regulations that come with a treatment like that or a product or service like that, I think over the next 5, 10 years and more is, going to be really, really important.
Exactly. No, thank you for that. So, big picture, can you even do this business? If so, how does it have to be structured? What licenses do you need? What level of licensure do your providers need? And how can you bring in business and how can you advertise? So those are the big ones. So thank you for your time today, Chase. I thought we had a good time and a good discussion. We have so much to talk about.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll get to do this again at some point, but I really enjoyed this. And thank you to the American Health Lawyers Association for giving us this platform. And
Thanks for having me.
that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.